G'day and welcome to the Fred Paul Show on ADH TV. Well, the forces of censorship have come out absolutely swinging lately. Australia's E-Safety Commission has sent a letter to a man in Canada demanding that he takes down a post on X, otherwise known as Twitter. If he doesn't, the site's owner, American owner, Elon Musk, will be fined up to $782,500. It wasn't long ago that a statement like that would have been dismissed as some sort of Orwellian fantasy, but here we are. The Canadian bloke who received the threat from the Australian E-Safety Commission is considered a bit of a legend by us here at ADH. His name is Chris Elston, but you might know him by his Twitter handle, Billboard Chris. Essentially, he travels the world attending pro-transgender rallies with a sandwich board proclaiming his fundamental opposition to transgender ideology and the medical reassignment of children. He's often assaulted for his efforts, but bravely standing up for his belief that, scientifically speaking, men are irrefutably men and women are irrefutably women is not all he does. Elston recently posted a comment about an Australian transgender person called Teddy Cook, who had been appointed to an advisory panel at the World Health Organization. He was criticised for his promotion of drug use and various other sexual activities. Cook complained to the E-Safety Commission, who then fired off the threatening letter to Billboard Chris. Chris Elston dug in his heels, telling Rebel News recently, quote, "Individuals like Teddy Cook, a woman who thinks she's a man and who promotes bestiality, bondage, mutilation and drugs, have no business writing health guidelines for people struggling with various mental health issues. We need evidence-based healthcare, not ideologically based harm, which what trans health actually is." Well, the Daily Mail now reports that the offending post on X was removed, at least in Australia. If this is correct, you'd have to give round one of this fight to the forces of censorship. Or is that round two? Last February, the Commission sent a letter to X stamping its foot and telling X to explain what it was doing to safeguard against child sexual exploitation. X's response was deemed inadequate and a fine of $610,000 was imposed, which X hasn't paid. So it's 1-1 between the censor and the free speech platform, with about another 50 rounds to go. My money's on Elon Musk in this fight. But all that is just a sideshow to the bigger censorship issues, which are to do with TikTok, or what I prefer to call it, TikToxic, and Instagram, which this week vowed to limit political content on its platform. There are calls now to ban TikTok in Australia, Britain and the United States, as well as a whole host of other countries. If those calls succeed, it will bring us, Australia, into line with, and you couldn't make this up, China, the country that created and essentially controls TikTok. That's right. Western politicians are arguing to emulate the censorship being imposed by a communist dictatorship. Well, there are actually two sides to this. China knows TikTok has an appalling influence on the young people who use it. It reduces their attention spans, distracts them from acquiring more useful knowledge, and mostly turns them into unbearable narcissists. And that is why it's banned in China. So if it's not good enough for the country that created it, why should it be good enough for us? Well, the United States House of Representatives answered that question last Wednesday, passing a bill by a large majority telling TikTok to divest itself of its Chinese ownership or be banned in the US. The bill is yet to be passed by the US Senate, but the odds are that it will. But what about the First Amendment? and the sacred right to free speech, Tucker Carlson said on his own network last week. Carlson said, if you're really worried about Chinese influence, well, you wouldn't allow the Chinese government to buy up all your farming land, donate billions of dollars to your most prestigious universities, control water and electricity supplies, take over your manufacturing sector, or let tens of thousands of them invade the country over the southern border. Nor would you let the Chinese Communist Party run biolabs or cover up for them when they unleash a supposedly scary virus on the world. Well, Tucker, they are very valid points. It's only in regards to TikTok that the governments of the West are overtly bullish about their national sovereignty. For everything else, they just bend over. So why is the government in the US and elsewhere around the world, including Australia, targeting TikTok? Well, for a start, TikTok is getting too big for its boots. The Financial Times reported recently that TikTok earned $120 billion in revenue last year and is, quote, on track to overtake Facebook owner Meta as the world's largest social media group by sales, unquote. This is, more than anything else, extremely embarrassing for us in the West. How could TikTok possibly compete against the likes of Facebook, X and Instagram? These are apps created in the dynamic capitalist West by people who deeply understand what consumers want and how to deliver them. A couple of Chinese engineers couldn't possibly come up with anything to match that, could they? Well, the answer is yes, they could, and they have. And that is because, not to put too fine a point on it, the West has lost its mojo. Our leading corporations are more interested in virtue signalling than they are in offering interesting products. No wonder they've been scooped by TikTok. Politicians, who should be equally embarrassed by the rise of TikTok under their watch, say their opposition to TikTok is on national security grounds. The most prominent of them in Australia is Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson.
The plan is not to ban TikTok. The plan is to make TikTok safe by removing the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. And the threat of the ban is just the enforcement mechanism to make sure that TikTok complies with the law. The end that I hope for is that Australians can continue to use TikTok, but just without the risk that their data is abused and without the risk that the Chinese Communist Party can put its thumb on the algorithm to pump disinformation into our democracy. So if they're acting like a rational commercial company, they should embrace this opportunity. Some independent assessments have said that TikTok is worth up to $160 billion. And if the choice is accept a payday of $160 billion or stand by and allow your app to be banned and lose that value, then that would be a very irrational choice. But it would be quite an illustrative choice because I suspect ByteDance would operate as it is, an extension of the Chinese government, not as a commercial entity, and that would be revealing. But I've been extensively briefed by our intelligence community on the danger of TikTok, which it obviously wouldn't be appropriate for me to go into detail with, but let's just point to some things that are in the open source arena. But number one, TikTok was exposed for using their app to spy on journalists to identify their sources, and they lied about it. Number two, independent researchers have found on sensitive topics to the Chinese government, like Xinjiang, there is far more pro-Chinese government propaganda on the platform than any other comparable platform. And on issues sensitive and divisive in the West, like Israel and Gaza, there's far more pro-Hamas content than any other platform. And when this was pointed out, how did TikTok respond? They shut down the research tool that allowed these independent researchers to make those points and to identify that. So TikTok is a bad faith actor. It is a risk to our democracy. It's a risk to our national security. And the government should take action here to protect Australians from this very serious threat.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese isn't quite as alarmed, saying he hasn't had advice to ban or put pressure on TikTok. He says the national security concerns need to be balanced with the popularity of the app, especially among young people, most of who are, like him, Taylor Swift fans. You can accuse Albo of lots of things, but not knowing his core demographic isn't one of them. Well, if you can ban TikTok on national security grounds, should you also ban Facebook for interfering in elections? During the 2020 presidential election and campaign in the US, Facebook brazenly withheld information from Hunter Biden's laptop detailing his rampant drug use and corrupt connections to his dad Joe's political career. A survey in the United States in 2022 found that 79% of Americans thought the suppression of information about Hunter during the 2020 election campaign swung the result, handing the White House to Joe Biden. To make things more complex, Donald Trump, who almost banned TikTok while he was president, has now flip-flopped, reportedly after a private meeting with major American TikTok shareholder, billionaire Jeff Yass. He said, quote, "There are a lot of people on TikTok that love it. There are a lot of young kids on TikTok who will go crazy without it." And he added that Facebook would become bigger, which is a worse enemy of the people. Here's another quote. "I think Facebook has been very bad for our country, especially when it comes to elections." Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Well, what exactly is the nature of the threat from TikTok? Well, let's bring in China expert and outspoken critic, Andrew Phelan. Andrew, welcome.
Hi, Fred. Good to be with you. I see to this point in time, you've sort of framed the conversation around social media, around free speech, around comparing it to Western apps and so on. There's another dimension to this entirely, which, of course, if you forget about social media for a moment and you think about warfare or military as we traditionally think of it, and China's going through the biggest military buildup since the Pacific War, since World War II. It's now 50% of the world's new ship tonnage. And there are flashpoints in our region, in our part of the world, between India and China in the Himalaya, water cannoning, Philippine Coast Guard vessels in their own waters. In the Taiwan Strait, we've seen a record number of military incursions there. And also Hong Kong has had the last gasp of any freedom and democracy snuffed out of it.
That's all true. So, Andrew, how does this relate to TikTok? What is the nature of the threat from TikTok's presence on Australian phones?
Yeah. The relation to that is there's a concept espoused by a couple of senior PLA generals in the late 90s. It's called unrestricted warfare. And they consider TikTok to be part of that. Psychological warfare. And when you think that young people, they don't read the Australian or the Fin Review or the Sydney Morning Herald, they get their info from TikTok to a large degree. So one of the things that's come up since October 7 is the use of TikTok to promote a pro-Palestinian view of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. And that's very much in Beijing's interest. We've also seen in the last year, TikTok tracking journalists that have been critical of China. So there's a
well, can we just compartmentalise these? Let's just talk about the propaganda for a start. How is TikTok being used to propagandise the CCP's political perspective?
Well, it's very subtle. But in your commentary, you mentioned that TikTok's banned in China. That's not quite correct. It's not banned as such. It's just not used in China because it's designed for an external audience. The domestic equivalent of TikTok is called Douyin, and it's essentially the same product. It's just that the algorithm's different because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want its youth spending their time on digital crack, wasting their time on little dance moves when they could be learning, good little Boy Scout educational things like how to build rockets and good patriotic values and things like that. So they would rather the youth of the West rot their brains on this stuff rather than reading or doing their homework. So that's very intentional. And you could make the point that, what's the difference between TikTok and Facebook? I agree with you on Facebook and its left-leaning, political bias in the last election, 100%. The difference is, of course, that in the case of TikTok, any data that's being captured is being captured by an authoritarian state that is the greatest threat to the security of Australia and other Western countries
Right.
in our
Okay.
history.
Let's just again compartmentalize that. So we've established that it is it is an instrument of propaganda. It is promoting the Hamas side of the conflict in Gaza. I expect it favours CCP. Anything to do with China, it favours the CCP's view on things. The other aspect, of course, though, is it is a massive operation in harvesting data. Now, can you just explain to viewers who aren't as familiar as you about this how the CCP uses that data against us?
So if you were sitting at home and you saw on the evening news that a plane load of Communist Party apparatchiks in mouse suits had just landed at Mascot or wherever your local airport is, and some of them were on the way to your house, and they knocked on the door and they said, "Hi, Fred, I'm from the Chinese Communist Party. Would you mind handing over your diary, please, and your Rolodex?" You'd probably tell them politely, or maybe not so politely, "No, thanks." But that's what TikTok does. It harvests a ridiculous amount of data that's unnecessary and that's over and above what its competitor apps do. Things like facial recognition, keystroke patterns, these sorts of things. And you might think, well, so what if Xi Jinping knows what my face looks like and he knows that what music I like and so on and so forth? That's hardly the point. You've got to think of this in terms of, and it was interesting in the Australian this week, there was an article on the UK's policy towards TikTok. And 8 years ago, they probably said, so what if there's, hoovering up all this data? But with the advent of AI and artificial intelligence, these new tools and greater computing power, you've got to fast forward this into a year or two in the future and see how they will weaponize this data to tailor it to go after anyone and push any agenda that they like. It's a psychological warfare weapon of mass destruction, if you like.
Yeah, I agree. I highly recommend people read the book you alluded to earlier from 1999 called Unlimited Warfare. It is a completely different perspective on how to conduct a war. China, I think you and I will agree, we are probably I know you think we are. China is already at war with us now. Most Australians don't realise it, and TikTok could well be one of the key weapons in its armoury in influencing us and using that against us. Now, let's just get back to the data. How does if you've got TikTok on your phone, how will the Chinese Communist Party one day use that against you, just personally?
Well, they're able to harvest an enormous amount of data on you, your political views, whatever content that you put on TikTok, in addition to the data that I already mentioned. So the question is, when does that become handy? That can be used against dissidents, against journalists, against anyone that pushes back against China's narrative. It's interesting that not only is TikTok not available in China, but none of the apps that you mentioned, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or X, are available in China either. India, interestingly enough, under Narendra Modi, has taken a very assertive stance on these Chinese apps. Of course, India and China have clashed physically in disputed territory along the Himalaya. None of these apps are available in India. They just banned them all, which means there's more opportunity for Indian companies as well. So it can be argued that it's a kind of protectionism, but that's not the real reason they've done so.
Andrew, thanks for coming on the show.
Anytime, Fred. Cheers.
That's Andrew Phelan, a well-known and outspoken critic of the CCP. Well, what do the public think about the proposal to ban TikTok, or at least sever it from its overlords at the Chinese Communist Party? Where better to get an interesting opinion about that than at Sydney University, which, like most Australian campuses, has a conspicuously large proportion of Chinese students. I went down there to ask a few of them what they thought about all this, and to be honest, I was expecting all of them to shun my approaches. which many certainly did at first, but then I was pleasantly surprised to meet some who were more than happy to talk. They were well informed too, although, I gotta say, they were uniformly oblivious to the malign nature of the CCP. Do you use TikTok?
Sometimes I use like the Chinese version TikTok.
Are you aware that there's many calls around the world to ban TikTok?
Yeah, I know like the US government like try to do this, but I don't know. I think maybe they shouldn't do this. It's just a platform that let everyone to share their content, and also like I think the TikTok they already like do a lot of things to satisfy the U.S. government, such as like put the data in the U.S. and also like they already do have lots of effort.
Yeah, that's right. They store their data in the United States. That's
Yeah.
correct. But should we be afraid of the CCP having access to that data?
No, I don't think that they're just a company not very like related to the government. Yeah, they're separated.
No, sorry, I don't use TikTok.
Why not?
I don't really like this stream video stuff.
Oh,
I just want to spend more time on my career.
Well,
and,
you're obviously smarter than most people.
I'm not smarter, but I just have my own hobbies.
Have you heard about the calls to ban TikTok?
It's just in the United States, not in Australia, right?
Oh, in Australia as well.
well.
Senator James Patterson is calling for it.
I don't know, but I don't think that's not a very good like for corporations, of course, and not good for business.
But is it dangerous that the CCP has access to the data at TikTok?
I don't know. It's really a technical questions, but I think if it's an independent corporate, I don't think it's really a problem because there are lots of like technology companies in every countries. The government can control everything.
Well, if you thought that only the Chinese government was inclined to collect data on its citizens and censor them when their opinions become inconvenient, then a vote in the Australian Senate yesterday might just change your mind. Here is how Senator Pauline Hanson reported it on Twitter. Anthony Albanese's Labor government has just rammed digital ID legislation through the parliament. No debate was allowed and no questions were allowed to be asked of ministers. Labor, Greens, Pocock, Lambie, Tyrrell and Van all posted to pass this legislation. Shame on them all. Not only was this not debated during the last federal election campaign, it wasn't even debated before it was passed in the Senate. None of us have had the time to assess what is in this legislation, but you don't need to inspect it to know that it will, combined with a digital currency, another policy that is coming whether we want it or not, increase the government's power to spy on Australians and impose punitive measures on those of us who don't conform to its agenda. Here is One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts speaking about the bill.
Life is about to change for every Australian. As much as Senator Gallagher seeks to downplay the significance of introducing one central digital identifier for each and every Australian, the reality is this is the most significant legislation I've seen in my time in the Senate. It's the glue that holds together the digital control agenda by which every Australian will be controlled, corralled, exploited and then gagged when they speak or act in opposition. This bill will be misused because this bill is written to be misused. The government knows digital ID will be compulsory by the device of preventing access to government services, banking services, air travel and major purchases for any Australian who does not have a digital ID. The digital ID will in effect create a live data file of your movements, purchases, accounts and associates containing reference to every piece of data being held in the private and government sector as a first step in a wider agenda.
Do you get the feeling, as I do, that the relative calm we are experiencing at the moment is just a brief pause before the government declares another lockdown worse than those imposed during COVID? No wonder the e-Safety Commissioner is going after X. It is the only social media platform that has guaranteed to not censor debate. The government proved yesterday that it is not interested in debate, as if any more proof of that were needed. If the government passes its misinformation and disinformation bill later this year, then Australia is almost certainly done for. The freedoms that enabled this country to peacefully thrive will be gone. What was once a free and fair society will become a nation of centrally controlled subjects. This is precisely what the government warns us China will do if we don't ban TikTok. Which brings me back to Instagram, which is part of the same corporate group as Facebook, the platform that most Americans believe swung the 2020 presidential election. In February, Instagram announced it would limit the publication of content it deems, quote, potentially related to things like laws, elections, or social topics. Well, that could mean anything. As Senator Malcolm Roberts says, the tech giants are all part of the same agenda.
Google, Facebook and other tech giants have been building huge data files on every Australian for years. Those huge data files containing every website you visited, every post you made on their social media, everything you have ever bought online, and the keywords scanned from conversations overheard by Siri and Alexa in your home are now unmasked. Until now, that data was anonymised using a unique identifier, rather than name and address, which has always been there as well. However, tech companies were not allowed to use it or to share data with others that included the person's name and address. Until now. Socialists love control. Socialism needs control. For socialism to exist, there must be control. The government knows control will be used by government to identify people who say mean things on social media to speed up enforcement of our new laws against saying home truths to crazy or dishonest people. No hiding behind anonymous accounts or false addresses. You can expect a knock on your door at home, work or school, as we're seeing happening in other countries with digital identity already in place. Only by being able to keep tabs on citizens 24/7 can the government possibly hope to introduce the wealth heist they have planned